Former Steinhoff Chairperson Christo Wiese has welcomed the Reserve Bank's move to attach the retailer's former CEO Markus Jooste's assets. It was part of a High Court order for property valued at around 1.4 billion rand, along with the Silveroak Trust worth about 98 billion rand. It's also the largest action, or should I say latest action, in holding Jooste accountable for fraud, which saw the collapse of Steinhoff in 2017, which cost the company about 200 billion rand. The former CEO has since been suspended by the accounting body SAICA for contravening exchange control regulations relating to the movement of money between South Africa and foreign jurisdictions.
Many people, including Jooste, thought that there would be no serious consequences for what had been done to many people in South Africa and abroad. And this just shows that although the wheels turn slowly, they do turn. Well, the criminal charges have been laid by several people. Personally have laid 3 criminal charges against Jooste already 4 or 5 years ago, and other people that I'm aware of have also laid criminal charges. So the charges have been laid, and the process is now beginning to gain traction.
All right, let's get reaction on this story now, and we're joined by the editor of the Financial Mail, Rob Rose, who speaks to us from Johannesburg. Rob, good morning to you, and thank you very much for making time for this discussion. Let's start with whether or not this is a positive image for the country in its fight against corruption and issues of money laundering. Why am I asking you this question? Well, is this about painting a very positive image of the country ahead of the decision by the Financial Action Task Force on whether or not to place the country on that dreaded grey list? Or do you think that this is genuinely a move by authorities to deal decisively with a matter that has been ongoing now for at least 5 years?
Morning. Well, the thing is that the authorities have been dealing with this for a while. So I think that they have wanted to do something. I mean, part of the Financial Action Task Force issues around the potential grey listing is that we take too long to prosecute cases, take too long to hold people accountable for money laundering and various things like that. And I think that this, that is definitely one of the things that is on the authorities' minds. And I think that this won't hurt at all in terms of that. Having said that, I do believe that the process has been in the works for a long time. It has just taken far too long to get to this point.
It has taken long to get to this point, Rob, but I suppose the other question for South Africans is whether or not this is going to stick. This is a seizure of his assets. This may well be handed back to him, unless, of course, we have it completely wrong. The Reserve Bank is making this move. Law enforcement, on the other end, they have been reluctant even to come on to tell us where they are in their investigation of this matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is significant that it's the Reserve Bank that has done this, and that the NPA and the Hawks that have been investigating this case for, as Christo Wiese said, 4 or 5 years now. I mean, Steinhoff collapsed in 2017, which is essentially coming up for 5 years, and we've had no arrest at all in this. We've had no asset forfeiture from the actual NPA on this at all. So it is remarkably slack of the authorities not to have acted in this case, certainly because some elements of it are quite simple. Some parts of it are obviously quite complicated. I think accounting fraud is necessarily complicated, but there are elements to this that actually aren't that complicated and certainly could have been done a lot quicker than it has actually taken place.
This relates, as the reports go, Rob Rose, this relates only to suspected exchange control contraventions as opposed to the wider fraud, which involves an amount of about 106 billion rand in fictitious and irregular transactions. So I go back to the question I've just asked you about whether or not this could still be reversed, and the Reserve Bank saying, well, given the failure of law enforcement to move on their end, we have no choice but to release these assets back to him.
Yes, I mean, the point is that the Hawks should be investigating actual accounting fraud, insider trading, and various other elements to it. In this case, the Reserve Bank is talking about exchange control contraventions. And what we do know in this case is that there were many cross-border deals where money was shifted across the borders through various front companies and various entities. And I think that a lot of that is very impeachable and very dubious. So I think that certainly they can make a case that this can remain, that this freezing order can remain in place. But having said that, you do want the NPA, you do want the Hawks to actually act on the actual main fraud. But I do think there's enough to hold these assets for a while. There was 19 billion euros that crossed borders when the company listed overseas. And I think that there's a lot of money that has moved through very dubious means. For example, Silveroak, the wine farm, the way in which that was paid for, the way in which the ownership of that was essentially hidden in various entities, took place across borders too. So there are certainly justifications for holding the assets that have now been frozen there for a bit longer, certainly.
Rob, in a documentary that I watched, which you were quite intimately involved in, it's called Steinheist, there is mention there about SARS acting in a particular way related to a person that is known to be close to Markus Jooste. Do you want to take us into exactly what happened there?
Is this the SARS case involving the forest?
The SARS case, indeed.
So in that case, what happened is that SARS looked through the corporate veil and found that this one company, Fihag, that has been implicated in many of these cross-border transactions, that the ultimate shareholding, the ultimate ownership of this company at one stage belonged to Markus Jooste. And in this case, what had happened was that Steinhoff had essentially decided not to buy some forests in Knysna, and Markus Jooste had himself, through this company, bought the forests and had benefited from this to the tune of, I think it was 200 million that SARS eventually claimed from him. And I think that happened in 2011. And I think that's what tipped a lot of people off to the fact that not all is entirely kosher at Steinhoff. When you have a CEO that is making money and large amounts of money off your shareholders, I think that's a big red flag to a lot of people, and certainly to investors, that you need to look deeper into what's happening at a company. And so that's one of the many warning signs that I think a lot of investors missed with Steinhoff going back. This was at least 6 years before the company actually collapsed in December 2017. So there were many instances where we've seen these kind of things coming. What we saw yesterday at Silveroak and in Hermanus, this has been coming for a long time.
How much pressure does this put on law enforcement authorities like the Hawks, the NPA?
Well, I certainly think the very fact that you called them and asked them to come on your show this morning and they declined means that they are feeling the heat. They're feeling the heat from this each time they appear in Parliament and are unable to answer questions from the MPs about why this case hasn't gone to court. You don't want to be in a situation where the NPA arrests people and can't prosecute the case properly, where they ask for interminable delays, because I think that creates another sort of cloud over the NPA. But you do want them to act a lot sooner. When you look at comparable frauds, international frauds, financial frauds, like Enron, like Wirecard, the arrests and the prosecutions have happened a lot faster than this. So I think it's important for, I suppose, corporate justice and for the fact that we want our corporate sector to be accountable, that this actually does happen sooner rather than later. And I think the NPA, I think, would probably agree with that.
If and when the Hawks and the National Prosecuting Authority finally show their hand in this matter, for how long do you think the South African Reserve Bank can hold on to these assets?
Sure, that's a question that I suppose would need to see the details in the court papers of exactly which transactions they are impugning. Markus Jooste will have a chance now to go to court and argue that the assets should be released and unfrozen, and I'm pretty sure he will do that. so far he's indicated when he was found guilty by the regulator of insider trading, he went and challenged that. So I think that you're going to see Markus Jooste challenging many of these actions that are likely to come soon. So I think that there's a good while in which these assets can remain under lock and key, I suppose, before the asset forfeiture unit of the NPA gets involved. But I think that also at some point becomes inevitable.
Rob, you would have followed proceedings in Parliament, and this related to the Hawks' capacity in investigating complex crimes such as this one. And there was a very clear admission that they are lacking in as far as cases like this are concerned. I ask you this question because in that documentary where you are involved, you make mention of the fact that Markus Jooste, it is now common knowledge that he tipped off his close associates about what was going to happen in 2017 and before the plunge of the share price of Steinhoff. And these people were subsequently able to sell off their shares. And you said that on that aspect alone, the Hawks should and could have acted. Why have they not acted?
That's a very good question. I mean, like you mentioned, I mean, certainly what happened is a week before Steinhoff collapsed, he tipped off various people, including his driver and a former rugby player, to sell their shares, and they avoided the loss. And that would fit pretty squarely, you would imagine, within the definition of insider trading. And the regulator, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, had a hearing, and they found Markus Jooste guilty and levied the largest fine ever in their history on Markus Jooste, which has since been, he appealed that particular ruling. But the issue is that they could have certainly have acted against Markus Jooste in this case. They haven't, because I think that what the Hawks wanted to do is bring this entire case together with the entire complicated financial fraud. So they wanted to throw the entire book at Markus Jooste as opposed to going for individual charges. And that's a prosecution strategy that I think they wanted to employ, but I think that it doesn't help see justice be done in the eyes of many who are asking why 5 years later, having lost money in their pensions, having seen the corporate sector infected by this paranoia around companies like Steinhoff, why that hasn't actually been happening, why there hasn't been the kind of accountability that we need. So I think that they could have done that, and they didn't do it, and I think that that's the strategy they chose, and I think that it's very debatable as to whether that was the right one.
Final question to you, Rob, and again, I make reference to this documentary that you were involved in. In a way, you actually do look into the psyche of the person, Markus Jooste, the things that made him tick. This is 1.4 billion worth of assets, and this includes his home in Hermanus. In that documentary, I'm led to believe that that's where he still stays at the moment. The wine farm has been taken, 5 vehicles, art and jewelry. Do you think that this is likely to make him feel the pain somewhat, or does this really not matter to him? He possibly could have other assets elsewhere. He could easily move from Hermanus and live somewhere else.
Well, as part of this court order, he's been asked to hand in a list of his assets and what assets he might have. What we do know about him is that he's been quite adept in secreting assets away in various places through various front companies and various individuals helping him do this. So, quite whether the corporate structures will lead him to reveal all that he might be the beneficiary of we'll have to see what happens there. He hasn't felt the arm of the law for 5 years, but in a sense, this must have been a sort of Damocles hanging over him for that time, because there were certainly expectations in his mind, I'm sure, and those of his lawyers, that this would happen at some point. So in a sense, I suppose the ball has finally got rolling, and he would have anticipated this. It does make it more acute, I think, when the authorities come and do seize your assets and tell you that effectively this is now under the stewardship of the Reserve Bank. So it does bring it home a bit, but whether he will still feel that he can escape this, whether he still feels he can answer to these charges, I think is what we need to see. When he appeared in Parliament in 2018, or 2019 it was, he had a story that he'd prepared and he stuck to it of why he thought there was no fraud, there was nothing wrong with the company. And I think that's a version that he's been prepping for the last couple of years, and I think that's a version we'll probably see a lot more of now. But he certainly would have anticipated that at some point this would happen.
Rob Rose, let me thank you very much for your time and your explanation as to your understanding of this case. After the